Okay, welcome. Good afternoon and welcome to the event, US-Mexico Presidential Elections, Insights from a Former Ambassador on some of the most critical issues. As you know, the upcoming 2024 presidential elections in Mexico and the United States have the potential to reshape the bilateral relationship. Key issues such as trade, security cooperation, immigration policies between the bordering countries could be reshaped by the outcome of the simultaneous elections in the US and Mexico. The Georgetown Americas Institute is pleased to host Arturo Sarucán, former ambassador of Mexico to the United States, for a conversation with Michael Reed, former Latin American editor at The Economist, currently at LSE, to delve into the main topics that will basically shape the bilateral relation between the US and Mexico in the next decade. This event is co-sponsored by Georgetown Americas Institute and the Latin American Policy Association of the McWhorter School of Public Policy. Let me briefly read you the bios of our two esteemed guests. Arturo Sarucán, it's a highly respected Mexican diplomat with a distinguished career in international relations. Over the past 3 decades, he has held positions in the Mexican government, serving as ambassador to the United States from 2007 to 2013, a period marked by significant developments in the relationship, including efforts to enhance security cooperation and promote economic ties between the two countries. Prior to his appointment, he was director for North American Affairs and chief of policy planning in the Foreign Ministry, and he also served as Mexico's Consul General in New York City. Ambassador Sarucán holds a degree in international relations from the Universidad Iberoamericana and a master's degree in U.S. foreign policy from the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. Michael Reed is an author, journalist, and speaker specializing in Latin American, Iberian, and international affairs. In 2023, he was appointed as a visiting professor of the practice at the School of Public Policy at LSE. From 1994 until 2023, he was a staff journalist for The Economist. From 2014 to 2022, he wrote the Bello column on Latin American and was a senior editor and Spain correspondent. Prior to that, he was the magazine's Americas editor, its correspondent in Brazil, consumer industry correspondent, and correspondent in Mexico and Central America. He spent most of the 1980s based in Lima, covering the Andean region for The Guardian and the BBC. He recently published a book, Spain, The Trials and Triumphs of Modern European Country. His previous books, or among his previous books, we can find Forgotten Continent, A History of the New Latin America, and Brazil, The Travel Race of a Global Power. Let me just leave Michael and Arturo in conversation. And let me just make one announcement. I mean, I'm extremely thankful that Arturo came today. I mean, he's a huge fan of Barça that is playing right now. So we might excuse him if every 15 minutes he checks his phone. So with that, let me turn it to Mike.
Thank you, Ana. Oh, do we need the mic?
Yeah, for the...
Yes, obviously. Is that better? Yes. Okay. Well, for those online, I was merely saying it's a great pleasure to be here. So, Arturo, this is, as we know, a big year of elections in the world in general, no? And in particular in North America, the two most important countries in North America are holding elections. Obviously, the US election looks very, very tight, too close to call at this stage. The Mexican election in June, on the contrary, on the face of things, on the basis of the opinion polls, looks as if it's going to be a fairly easy victory for Claudia Sheinbaum. The polls give her a lead of 20 points or so over her chief opponent, Xochitl Galvez. They've been pretty stable, but do you expect the election actually to be much tighter? And do you think the result is in doubt?
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Alejandro. It's a pleasure to be at Georgetown. As a proud alumnus of El Colegio México, I just need to clarify that I did my BA in El Colegio México and not in the Universidad Iberoamericana, but it's a distinct pleasure to be in this conversation with my dear friend Michael Reed, and do take a look at his book on Spain. It is a fantastic tour de force of Spanish politics in the last decades, and it's worth the read. Yeah, there's no doubt that the election in Mexico today is Claudia Sheinbaum's to lose. I don't think that what you're seeing in the polls is an actual reflection of the real difference, because a lot of the polls have been bought by the campaign of Morena and Claudia Sheinbaum. I think the real difference is somewhere between the mid-teens and the upper teens. I don't think it's 20 or above, where some polls suggest it lies the real gap between them. I think it's going to tighten naturally. We've just gone through the first month of the official campaign. Yes, they've been campaigning for a long time, but the campaign didn't officially start until March the 1st. So what we're seeing is the first month of the campaign. In fact, Xochitl, I think, closed the gap during that inter-campaign period. Absurd methodology that we have in Mexico for the campaigns. She did close the gap a bit, but certainly she's on the back foot. I think that if I were a betting man, which I'm not, I'd probably put my money on Morena winning the presidency, but I think it's going to tighten. Some have asked me, does Xochitl have a chance of winning? She would if two things happen in the line. The first one is she needs voter turnout to reach the two historical levels that we've seen in Mexico in López Obrador's landslide victory in 2018, when he ratcheted up to 63.2% of voter turnout, and Fox's victory in 2000, where he achieved 63.9% of voter turnout. Xochitl, to be competitive, needs to reach that threshold of voter turnout. And that's why sort of defeating the idea of this is a done deal, this election has been cooked, etc., is one of the challenges she faces. The other one, to be very frank, and my dear friend Silvano Aureoles is the former governor from the PRD of Michoacán, is here in the room. And I don't think he will mind terribly me saying this, but she has a branding problem. The three traditional parties in the opposition alliance, the PAN, the PRI, and the PRD, have a branding problem with a good chunk of Mexican voters. And so how does Xochitl weave the need to have this party structure mobilize and turn out the votes that she needs to tighten the race, or ensure that Morena does not have a supermajority in Congress, which is...
Do you think, what are the chances of...
No, I don't think Morena...
You need 2/3 in both houses to be able to change the constitution.
I don't think Morena will reach that. In fact, I think there's a very interesting dynamic taking place. There are 8 governorships in Mexico City up for grabs. It's very interesting because there the outcome is a toss-up. It could be 5-4 for Morena or 5-4 for the opposition. Mexico City is much closer than what I think many of us thought it would be at this stage. There's a real chance that the opposition could take Mexico City away from the Morena. Remember, the city has been ruled by the PRD and then Morena since 1997. So this would be a big deal. And 2 of the states where Morena actually governs, Veracruz and Morelos, are tight because the incumbent governors have done a pretty lousy job. And it's not a surprise that the former Interior Secretary of Mexico, Adán Augusto, who was part of Claudia Sheinbaum's campaign, has now been assigned to be the political coordinator of the campaign for Morelos. So that's where I think there's some very interesting developments taking place. But to sum up, I think it's going to be a hard slog for Xochitl to catch up with Claudia. The first debate that took place this Sunday didn't provide a knockout blow for Xochitl that she would have needed to sort of try and change potential perceptions. I don't think Morena is going to achieve a supermajority. And the very interesting issue of what's going to happen with governorships in Mexico City, which could, either way, 5-4 Morena or 5-4 for the opposition, it's a pretty good result to the opposition.
That's a prior question. I mean, President Andrés Manuel López Obrador spent a lot of time attacking the National Electoral Institute. He's cut its funds. He would like to, he has tried and failed to change the way that it's chosen. Will this election be free and fair?
I think it's going to be a free election, no doubt. I don't think it's a fair election. I think what we're seeing in Mexico is the regurgitation of the elections of state of yore of the PRI days, where the president, where the apparatus of the state, where the resources of the state are being thrown to support the incumbent candidate. It's not a coincidence that López Obrador from day one, but this has increased as we got closer to the electoral process, has taken on the National Electoral Institute, Mexico's autonomous elections body, which has been a reference point worldwide. The UN, throughout the decades since INE was created, has used INE as a template for electoral authorities and running elections in other places around the world. López Obrador has taken on INE. López Obrador has taken on our access to transparency agency. He's obviously taking swipes at the electoral tribunal. He has been constantly seeking to undermine the independence of the Supreme Court and the judiciary. And this is I think one of the most there are probably two factors I'm really concerned about looking at Mexico in the years ahead. The first one is the evisceration of the Mexican state, of the institutions that were built over 2-3 decades of democratic transition, and which, by the way, explain why López Obrador is in power today, helped ensure that López Obrador, when he won in 2018, did so. The second one is the role of the armed forces in public policies beyond national security and public security, whether it's building refineries or running new airlines that have been created, or the one that most troubles me and concerns me is when they were handed the control of customs and ports, because the amount of money, illicit money, moving day in and day out through the customs, tainting and potentially corrupting the armed forces, is something that's, I think, extremely dangerous.
Sure. Well, that kind of leads me on to my next question, which is, if Claudia Sheinbaum wins, let's talk a bit about what do you think about what sort of president she might be. I mean, it's been a unwritten rule of the Mexican political system since the early 1930s that the president has a lot of power for their 6 years, and then they are officially a nobody, and they do not intervene directly in the political system. I think many people in 2018, when López Obrador won such an overwhelming victory, thought that he might test the rule of no re-election. I mean, I think many of us thought that that would be a bridge too far for him. I always used to say when people ask me, there's a street in Tepoztlán, a small town near Mexico City, which is called Calle No a la Reelección. And if you have a street name, if you have street names for a political sufragio efectivo, no a la reelección, which was Francisco Madero's slogan, which is, yes, I abbreviated it. It was Francisco Madero's slogan with which he launched the Mexican Revolution. So in other words, if you have a political tradition which is embodied in street names, even somebody like López Obrador can't change it, I think. And he hasn't, but that doesn't mean that he will not try and continue to run the country. First question. So Claudia Sheinbaum is very much his creation as a politician, even though she's, in my view, been a fairly effective governor of Mexico City. I've met her, I've spoken to her. She is an articulate, intelligent person. But would she have a free hand to do as she wishes? First question.
I think the response to that question will depend a lot on what happens in Congress. I can't speak for Claudia Sheinbaum, but I think that if I was in her shoes or if I'm in her head, I think she herself would prefer a result where Morena does not have an absolute majority in Congress, because then her ability to push back against the president, same former president, I can't do that because I don't have the votes to do this in Congress, is going to be an issue. That's going to be I think that's going to be the acid test that she's going to face pretty early on, which is, can she wean herself from López Obrador seeking to call the shots or give his opinion from his ranch in Tabasco? I think she's a fairly pragmatic woman. On some fronts, I think she's more ideological, however, than López Obrador, foreign policy. I think Claudia does come from the Mexican tradition of Cuba sí, Yankees no, much more so than López Obrador. But the question, she's replicating some of the steps that the third López Obrador campaign implemented when he tried to approach the private sector and say, don't worry, I'm not going to be that bad. She is doing more or less the same with different business groups in Mexico right now. But the question is, A, how much willingness will she? I don't think she's going to break with López Obrador. I think she will.
What about some of his policies, for example, on energy?
I don't think she is on the record, Michael, in a Bloomberg interview. It must have been in the late summer of last year, I think, in which she basically said, I'm going to double down on López Obrador's energy policies, basically meaning the predominant role of Pemex and the utilities company CFE. She sort of signaled now that renewables and renewable energy policy will be an important feature of her administration. But at the end of the day, there might be a contradiction between that and the predominant role that she says she will continue to ascribe to CFE and Pemex. So that's one area which is, there's a bit of a question mark. I don't think you'll see a big reversal in the role of the armed forces and the roles that they're playing in public policies, which is, again, in my view, a big issue and a big challenge. I think she will be, I think she's, my sense is by conversations that I've heard with people who've talked to her about this, I think she understands that the fiscal situation is challenging, but at the same time, her campaign 2-3 weeks ago came out saying that there won't be a fiscal reform in a Sheinbaum government. So there are a lot of question marks still open, I think, Michael, on the front of how different and how much will she dovetail or not with López Obrador's policies and pet projects, some of them which will still be in implementation phase by the time she gets sworn in, if she wins on October the 1st.
Yeah, one feels with her that even more than most candidates, most leading candidates, she's kind of rather constrained in what she can say.
Well, she got extremely constrained by the president's rollout in February of his roster of constitutional reforms. That was in many ways, again, if I'm Claudia and I've just set up my campaign team and these are going to be my priorities and these are the people who are going to design my governmental program, and 3 days later the president rolls out a straitjacket of 24, most of them constitutional reforms, that's sort of saying that's the agenda for your campaign. So it's a challenge.
You mentioned the evisceration of the state. Do you think she believes in the evisceration of the state?
I think she will inherit the effects of the evisceration. Remember when those of you who are economists in the room will remember Luis Videgaray when he was finance secretary, his famous presupuesto base cero. I think that whoever wins come October the 1st will inherit un Estado mexicano base cero. The number of institutions, of checks and balances, is the bureaucracies, the destruction of government agencies. That is going to be a big challenge. And Claudia, I think, understands that she is going to be handicapped in some of these areas that today you don't have the means to be able to design and implement coherent public policy.
let's turn.
Immigration policy, for example, one of them.
Yeah, let's come on to that in a moment. But let's turn to this country. And everything suggests the election will come down to half a dozen states, as it did last time. In some of those states, the Latino vote is quite important. The Republicans are optimistic about winning more of the Latino vote than they did do in the past. The Latino vote, of course, is not a single vote. It's a series of different kinds of voters. But do you think they have a chance of making serious inroads into the Latino vote?
That's a very important question and a big question, particularly after what we saw in the 2020 presidential campaign, where a series of particularly districts in the southern part of Texas, which still voted for Biden, but where the percentage of votes won by the GOP and Trump really shot up. I have my own theory as to why that happened in southern Texas. It has to do with López Obrador's unctuous remarks here when he came in the midst of the presidential campaign to praise Trump and to say that Trump had never done anything to insult Mexico or Mexicans and had always respected Mexico. Those remarks were used in Spanish by the Trump campaign in Spanish ads, particularly in southern Texas. And I think that part of that may have filtered into voter patterns there. As you say, it's going to be a jigsaw puzzle. Latino votes, I think, in those 5-6 states that will determine the outcome of this election, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Arizona, Georgia, potentially Nevada. The Latino vote will be very important in Arizona. And in fact, it's one of the reasons why Biden won Arizona in 2020, because of the Latino vote. It will be important in Georgia because of the growing percentage of Latino voters in Georgia, which again is another state that Biden took from the Republicans in the Electoral College. And Nevada, which had started trending blue, is now probably trending back to its historical color, which has always been purple. And there, obviously, the Latino voters, particularly in the services industry, play a very important role. So I think that in those states that will determine the outcome, the Latino vote, at least in 3 or 4 of those votes, is going to be very important. I think the mistake that the Democrats have committed over decades is precisely thinking that the Latino vote is homogeneous, that it moves to the same heartbeat, that the issues that matter to the Latino bloc of voters are the same. And all of you in this room, and you know this very well, a Cuban-American voter in Florida has a very different political ideological outlook than a Mexican-American voter in California or in New Mexico, or a Colombian or a Dominican American voter in New York City. I think what the Republican Party probably has learned faster than the Dems is to try and segment their pitch to that different type of profile of Latino voter. But this is an issue, and that's why the interview that Univision decided to give Donald Trump and the way it conducted that interview raised all types of concerns. That's why Biden finally sat down with Univision last night. Well, it was a week ago, but it was aired last night. And I think the Latino vote is increasingly up for grabs. I think it will still, at the national level, trend overwhelmingly in favor of Dems, but I think increasingly the Latino voter is up for grabs.
Yeah. And if Donald Trump does win, I mean, he's once again in the last few months made a series of rather aggressive statements in relation to Mexico. I mean, Mexico has a large trade surplus with the United States, and we know that, well, by the account of, I think it was John Bolton, that when he was in office, when an issue in relation to any foreign country came up, Trump's first question was, what's the trade deficit? It's an obsession with him. There's the question of migration, there's the question of fentanyl and drug trafficking. I mean, it could be a very, very rough ride for Mexico. How do you see it?
Yeah, when I was ambassador, I would get Mexicans, Mexican business people, members of the press saying, "Oh, ambassador, aren't you sort of frustrated that Mexico is not part of a presidential campaign and that the campaigns don't debate the importance of the relationship with Mexico. And I said, thank God we're not in the presidential campaign. And we saw what happened precisely in 2016 when Trump injected Mexico into a presidential campaign. In 2020, unfortunately, all roads to the Republican campaign lead through the border with Mexico. And you've mentioned three of those issues: trade, immigration, and drugs and thugs. On top of that, you've got this subjacent argument in terms of the debate going on, raging right now as we speak on Capitol Hill, regarding Ukraine, regarding the Middle East, regarding relations with China, that the real national security threat to the United States isn't in Eastern Europe, it's not in the Middle East, it's not what's happening with China and what could potentially happen in the Taiwan Straits, it's the border with Mexico. And that is a very, very toxic combination. More so because, as is the case every 12 years, Mexico and the US have coincidental presidential electoral cycles. And we will have people campaigning in Mexico and in the United States at the same time. Fortunately, thank God, López Obrador will be handing in his presidential sash a full month before the United States goes to the polls, because there's an issue I'm frankly concerned about, which has to do with opening and closing the valves of migration flows to the US-Mexico border by López Obrador and the impact that could have on the election.
Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I will. But there is a real issue because, and in fact, I think many in Mexico still, I see one big looming concern as I see Mexico watching the US election. Most business people and many analysts sort of have this attitude of, as we say in Spanish, perro que ladra no muerde, the dog that barks doesn't bite. And it wasn't that bad during his first tenure in office. And the problem is that it could really get bad. Number one, because he's promised to impose 10% tariffs on all US imports. Remember that now Mexico, as of the end of last year, has become the #1 trading partner of the United States and the #1 seller of exports to the United States.
That means tearing up the USMCA.
Well, that would be a violation of the USMCA.
Yeah.
And Mexico, any administration, would be forced to reciprocate those tariffs. So okay, let's assume he's not going to impose 10% tariffs. Maybe it's going to be 5%, and he's maybe going to exempt Mexico and Canada, except for the automotive and auto parts sector, where he will impose 2.5% tariffs on Mexican exports in the automotive and auto parts sector. That in and of itself will require a response from Mexico in terms of a retaliatory tariff. So that's a big issue. The second one is his threat to use unilateral force to confront drug trafficking organizations.
Yeah. Just on trade.
Yeah.
I mean, there are some people in this country who think that the C in US in USMCA stands for China, not Canada, and that a lot of Chinese goods are coming through Mexico, repackaged, etc. Do you think that's a real problem? And do you expect?
I think it's a real challenge. I think that's the reason why Mexico and the United States governments have announced a bilateral working group to monitor new Chinese investments coming into Mexico. That explains the 2 bills that we now have in the US Senate on using USMCA's sunset clause revision, which starts in October of 2025, to determine whether Chinese companies are piggybacking on the USMCA by moving production to Mexico, taking advantage of nearshoring, and then obviously going around the tariffs that have been imposed on a certain series of sectors in China. It's a real issue. I think that Mexico, I think the US understands this. I think Mexico needs to finally engage and confront this and work hand in hand with the US, particularly in those sectors, energy, telco, the digital economy, auto parts, electronic vehicles, batteries, where there is an important challenge to Washington's decision to recalibrate its trade and economic relationship vis-a-vis China, and where Canada and Mexico play a very important role in the success or not that recalibration. But do you want to go into the immigration one?
Yes, I mean, when you said that you worry that López Obrador could turn the migration tap on or off, well, for most of his presidency, he's done as much as he's done quite a lot to turn it off quietly, right? So are you saying that you think he might turn it on just before the election? If so, what interest would he have in doing that?
There's no doubt that the López Obrador administration has been supporting U.S. in the case of Trump demands, in the case of Biden, U.S. requests to support the United States in controlling migration flows. But there's tangible proof, and we saw in December, Michael, that López Obrador has been opening and closing the valves. The reason why, in the midst of the December holidays, Secretaries Mayorkas, two administrations back, Secretaries Mayorkas and Blinken went down to Mexico on December 27th, is because on December the 6th, the chief of Mexico's National Immigration Agency announced that Mexico, despite an agreement reached by Blinken and López Obrador and then ratified with Biden on the margins of the APEC summit in San Francisco in November, that Mexico would no longer be repatriating Venezuelans by air from Mexican territory back to Caracas, arguing that they had no budget. And at the same time, there's proof and videos and photographs of the National Guard busing migrants, oh surprise, to a state governed by the PAN, an opposition party. And so you had the busing of the artificial movement of migrants to the northern part of the country by the government at the end of the year, plus the decision by the government saying we're not going to repatriate Venezuelans anymore. Why is López Obrador, I think, opening and closing the valves? I think that the basic reason is to extract political and diplomatic leverage vis-a-vis the Biden administration.
So two more questions before we open it up. You started talking about the risk of, well, the threat of forceful action on the question of drugs if Trump were to win. How real do you think that threat is, and what can Mexico do?
If we're guided by what actually happened in the first Trump administration, if those guardrails were still in place, I think we'd see a repeat of cabinet officials telling the president, or I'm sorry, Mr. President, you can't do it, or simply sort of pretending that they didn't listen. Given that the potential Trump 2.0 administration is setting about purging the civil service and the bureaucracy in Washington, that there's a plan with individuals who've already been sort of pre-vetted, pre-selected for specific positions, not only at the cabinet level, but several tiers down, that starts becoming a potential threat. And I think the possibility, if we were speaking in the first Trump administration, the possibility of a drone strike against a laboratory on the Mexican side of the border without the consent of the Mexican government, I would have said probably 30-70 against, a 70-30 against. With what we've seen, with what we've heard, with the dynamics that are taking place, the possibility of Trump actually doing something like this once he's in power, I think goes up considerably to a 60-40 in favor of him doing something like that.
And lastly, if President Biden wins another 4 years, one assumes that, broadly speaking, there'll be continuity in relation to policy towards Mexico and Latin America. What's your evaluation of that policy?
This is the tough one. I think Biden has tried to behave like the adult in the room in the relationship, even though López Obrador, every time that he has been able to, has been poking his finger in Biden's eye, you know, boycotting the Summit of the Americas, not going to the summit, North American summit this month in Canada, sort of trying to score diplomatic points by saying that he will cooperate on migration if Biden lifts the blockade, quote unquote, against Cuba. I'm against the embargo, but López Obrador or someone in his near circle should tell him that that's not a decision of the administration. It's a congressional decision. So I think given the lay of the land, given the political electoral challenge that that Biden has faced with migration flows, I think that in general, Biden has been keeping the relationship on a relatively even keel. I am very worried, however, that at the end of the day, the administration has been unwilling to confront López Obrador on other bilateral issues, with the growing and potential exception of fentanyl because of the brutal impact it's having on the opioid epidemic in the United States, and most certainly not addressing some of the increasing and worrisome signals of democratic erosion and backsliding that we're seeing in Mexico. And I think that down the road could haunt Washington and could haunt this administration.
Okay, thanks very much. Let's open it up to questions. If you could just say who you are, please.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Thank you, Mr. Reid. I am Alberto Marisca, student of the Master of Arts in Latin America Studies here at Georgetown. Ambassador, allow me to pose you a tricky case study scenario in foreign policy. Let's suppose that Trump wins the election. Let's suppose Trump violates, as you rightly show, the USMCA, which could be improbable, but is not unseen before in US foreign policy. US is not the champion of bilateral and multilateral treaties when it comes to trade. Now, this would allow a potential Sheinbaum government to see BRICS as a very, very delightful alternative. You reckon that last month there have been rumors about Mexico enter the BRICS, then the Ministry of Foreign Affairs negated that. Do you believe that this could really happen? Could Mexico enter the BRICS? Because at least in my eyes, the fact of having Mexico in the BRICS will be really the worst nightmare for the US administration in seeing a global South united, starting from Latin America and from Mexico. So your thought on that?
I don't think, even if there were a challenge by the Trump administration or a violation more than a challenge to USMCA, I don't think that Mexico's response will be to pivot to the BRICS for a number of ideological and strategic reasons, where I think the private sector and the heft and the weight of a relationship that has been taking place between Mexico and the United States since 1991, when we first negotiated NAFTA, will probably preclude that. There will very likely be some rhetoric and some diplomatic kabuki and shadow boxing with something like that. But I think where I think there will probably be an emphasis if something like that were to happen is to, and that's why ratification of the revamped, just as we revamped NAFTA into USMCA, there is a revamped agreement with the European Union, which is waiting for ratification in Brussels and in Mexico. I think that taking advantage of the fact that Chile and Mexico are the two countries in the world with the largest free trade agreement networks that any country has, I think what you will probably see is Mexico seeking to leverage that network of free trade agreements and maybe even deepen its trade relationship with China without necessarily saying, okay, we're going to kumbaya walk into the BRIC group.
Very good. Any more questions? Over there.
Ambassador, thank you very much indeed for your wonderful remarks. I wonder if you could address the issue of the tepid response of the United States to the invasion of the Mexican embassy in Quito. They were late in reacting, and they were, compared to everybody else in our region and compared to Europe, China, Russia, particularly given the fact that the United States was the victim of an Iranian invasion of their embassy during the end of the Reagan, beginning of the Carter administration. So how does their response late and tepid, I insist on that, effects. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, President López Obrador would be in complete concurrence with you because he lashed out the United States for the way that they initially, remember they did it in sort of two phases. That first very sort of lukewarm statement where they sort of encouraged both countries to solve the issue and to ensure that there was a diplomatic solution to the challenges. And then Jake Sullivan yesterday came out saying what he said finally, which was sort of a condemnation of what the Ecuadorian government had done. I think it was a mistake. I think the United States should have come out from the get-go saying this is unacceptable. I'm not going to get the administration off the hook. But I also would like to suggest that however reprehensible, however concerning, however unacceptable the actions by the Ecuadorian government were in walking into an embassy with armed force, it doesn't happen in a vacuum, and it hasn't happened in a vacuum. López Obrador, I'm a recovering diplomat. We had never, ever, ever in Mexico's diplomatic history had 3 ambassadors to 3 different countries in the same administration declared PNG in one Mexican administration, ever. We now have 3, Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador. All of these countries have similar ideological connections as to why, in response to López Obrador's actions and statements, 3 Mexican ambassadors in the last 5 years have been PNG'd. Again, please don't understand this as me providing any form of coverage or excuse to the Ecuadorian regime and government for what they've done. It's unacceptable. But there's also a general context where López Obrador loves to pontificate about Mexico's constitutional principles of foreign policy. One of those is the non-intervention in the domestic affairs of the nations. I've always said that López Obrador uses the principles of foreign policy as flashing lights. You see them now, you don't see them now, you see them now, you don't see them now. He applies them whenever anyone says anything about something that's going on domestically in Mexico, but he's triggered diplomatic crises. Panama did not accept a Mexican ambassador. They did not give him the agrément. We've had political diplomatic spats with Ecuador, with Panama, with Bolivia, with Peru. There was a bit of a tit for tat between Milei and López Obrador, which fortunately did not escalate. But this has been going on and on and on for 5 years. So there's a bit of a context there where I think that some people said, okay, this did not happen in a vacuum. That's no excuse again for Noboa's actions or for the twofer in the delayed response of the United States to decrying and condemning what is at all lights an unacceptable violation of diplomatic norms and conventions.
Very good. Question here.
Ambassador, thank you so much for being here. You mentioned the sunset clause for USMCA, which is Chapter 32. Could you develop a bit more on your worries of a potential revision of USMCA under a Sheinbaum Trump administration on both sides? And what would your recommendations be as a former ambassador to how Mexico should approach these revisions?
This is a very novel, it's when I was ambassador, I would say that if you looked at NAFTA and you looked at trade flows between Mexico and the United States, NAFTA was a 21st century trade agreement. If you looked at the border infrastructure, which allows that trade to go back and forth, we had a 20th century agreement because the last railroad crossing, until I was in office, that had been built at the time, the last railroad crossing to have been built on the US-Mexico border dated back to the Mexican Revolution in 1910. And that if you looked at, sorry, that was the 19th century agreement. And if you looked at the regulatory edifice of NAFTA, it was a 20th century agreement. NAFTA was negotiated when there was no such thing as Amazon or eBay or digital or IPR issues. And one of the reasons why we ended up in a pickle with the forced renegotiation of NAFTA was because When we achieved success in 1991, and I was a diplomatic tadpole here at the embassy when we got congressional ratification of NAFTA, everyone did the kumbaya high five. We spiked the ball in the end zone and we went home and we fell asleep. And we didn't understand that we needed to convey constantly to our three publics the importance of trade, why this was important, why, yes, there were losers, but there were winners, and that overall there was a slight net positive effect for trade in the region as a result of NAFTA. And if we had had hindsight, we would be now saying also, and the pandemic proved it, because what people suddenly realized was these integrated supply chains that had completely changed the way we produce stuff in North America. The Sunset Clause is a mechanism which seeks to ensure that there's a regular means by which we can calibrate whether a free trade agreement is delivering the goods, is working. It's tricky because what you need to prevent is people opening Pandora's box, because once you start opening an agreement for revisions, then this group and this industry that didn't get what they wanted in the original negotiation is going to pile everything to try and retweak the agreement. But the way it's drafted currently provides congressional debate and discussion, parliamentarian in the case of Canada, as to the effectiveness of the agreement. We need to ensure that we put to bed the ongoing current disputes that we have under USMCA dispute resolution mechanisms, particularly energy, which may or may not lead to a panel, and the exports of GMO corn of the United States to Mexico. The panel was going to rule in April. Wisely, someone whispered into the panel's ears and said, why don't you produce your ruling post June 2nd? That way, because we all know that the ruling is probably going to be contrary to Mexico's position. So why don't we sort of defang the politicization of the debate by pushing the ruling of the panel until after the Mexican election? And then you've got a case which the US lost, which Canada and Mexico presented on the interpretations of the rules of origin for auto parts, which, because of the 5 states, particularly 3 of those, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, the role that unions play in those states, the Biden administration has been kicking the can down the road and has not even said if it's going to comply with the ruling which ruled against US interpretation of those regs. We need to ensure that we have a relatively clean slate that shows that we're solving the issue, that the enforcement provisions of the agreement have teeth, that they're enforceable, because if we reach the October 2025 milestone, which is when the revision will start, and we've still got all these issues, whether they're state-to-state or investor-state dispute resolution mechanisms open, it's going to be particularly in the US Congress, a Congress that is extremely likely to be polarized, where we may have a change of control in the chambers, but not a change in the balance. It's likely, in my view, that the Republicans could seize the Senate. I think they may lose the House, so it'll be inverted to what we have today, but it'll still be a very polarized Congress. That in that context, and more so if we have a President Trump, that we can reach that milestone with as many signals that the dispute resolution mechanisms are working and resolving issues in a clear and level playing field manner.
Over here.
Thank you, Ambassador. You mentioned Venezuela earlier. What should we expect Mexico's response to be to the so-called election taking place in Venezuela?
Hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil.
Okay, and what do you expect of Mexico's continued role as a mediator between the Venezuelan opposition and the regime?
Remember, Mexico is not a mediator. Mexico is the host country of those conversations. So very different role and profile. I'll say it openly, I think some of you who know me may know this already. I'm a big critic of López Obrador's foreign policy. I think that the way Mexico has positioned itself on issues of democratic erosion or dictatorship in Latin America is shameful.
You think it would be different under Sheinbaum?
Very little. I don't think those issues will change at Claudia. So I think she will be much more conscientious about the way she enacts foreign policy. I think you won't see her using the bully pulpit to, on the cuff, impact and design foreign policy. What you've seen with the two foreign secretaries that we've had under the López Obrador administration is that both Marcelo Ebrard and Alicia Bárcena have to, turn themselves into a pretzel to undo or redirect whatever the president has said in the morning and the impact that has on bilateral or global relations. I don't see much of that dynamic changing, but I think it will be a much more serious and professional implementation of foreign policy than what we've seen so far. But in terms of where Mexico stands on Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, zero.
We don't have very much time left. Can I just get a sense of, are there many questions from the online audience or no? So let's take this one here, since all of you are very good at asking questions.
Hi, Ambassador. Thank you for coming to speak with us. I'm Carlos, undergraduate student here. Just Mexico City. Just expanding on the topic of foreign policy, I was wondering what is your take on the main differences, but also similarities that the two candidates would show in their foreign policy choices and overall agenda and ideology?
I think this last issue, Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua, is one where there would be significant differences between a Galvez administration and a Sheinbaum administration. I think that Xochitl Galvez has said that she will talk about violation of human rights and democratic erosion in the region and in the world. I think that's one clear area of distinction. I think Xochitl Galvez would be much more vocal and muscular in her approach of the importance of the relationships with Mexico and Canada than Claudia would, for a number of ideological, and also she has remember, Morena is a big tent of very strange bedfellows. You've got former communists, you've got evangelists, you've got former PRI. So it's a mishmash of very different ideological inclinations, but there's a hardcore, hard right group inside Morena, which today surrounds the president and explains hard left group surrounding the president, which explains many of the president's positions on Julian Assange, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, not condemning Hamas as a terrorist group, et cetera, et cetera. I think both would seek to strengthen the foreign service, despite López Obrador's promise that he would not do what previous Mexican governments had done of appointing political appointees to ambassadors, to embassies and consulates. This administration in Mexico has broken all records in terms of the numbers of political appointees running embassies and consulates around the world. So I think both of them there would try and sort of boost morale in the foreign service. I think both recognize the importance of the foreign service, though I think there are some, again, under the Morena tent that think the foreign service is sort of a bureaucracy of the old regime and that they need to be purged. I think you would see Claudia much more inclined to play a role, per your question, of sort of engaging with global South partners. Having said that, I don't think that her move would be, okay, we're going to bring Mexico into the fold of the BRICS, but you would see much more activity in South-South diplomacy from a Sheinbaum administration. I hope that both understand that what we've seen also in terms of López Obrador's engagement with the Mexican diaspora in the United States is untenable. It's incredible. I've always said that López Obrador is the most sophisticated retail politician that Mexico has had in its history. No one knows the country like López Obrador. But for a guy who is precisely the most sophisticated retail politician in Mexico's history, the fact that as a sitting president, he has never, ever once met with Mexican diaspora communities in the United States. Not once. That's stunning. We've got 11 million Mexicans living in the United States and 35 million Mexican Americans. Every single president, even at least once, has had a big event with Mexican diaspora community, with the Mexican diaspora community in the United States. López Obrador has never, ever, for a man who knows Mexico and Mexicans like him, that he has never sat down with the diaspora here, that contrary to what happened in 2006 and 2012, when the votes of Mexicans abroad went for the PAN candidates, Calderón and then Josefina Vázquez voted in 2012. In 2018, López Obrador won the, if you tallied just the votes of Mexicans living abroad, he won 62% of all votes of Mexicans living abroad, and most of them are here in the United States. That is something that needs to be rethought. Mexico's engagement with its diaspora, but also Mexico's immigration policy, because today we don't have an immigration policy. We have accepted the outsourcing of enforcement-driven immigration policies by the United States.
Well, I think with that, we've come to the end of what's been a very stimulating discussion. I must say, I don't want to be Panglossian, but I do think there's a sense in which, remarkably, the Mexican-US relationship now is so profound in so many ways in terms of the link.
Institutionalized is the word that I would probably.
Institutionalized, but also every day. And, in the economy, but also people to people and cultural and all those things. That it survived one term of President Trump. It seems to me not preordained that it would suffer serious damage under a second President Trump. It might. It's a worry, obviously. And that is a remarkable change compared with 30, 40 years ago. No?
I think the relationship is profoundly institutionalized. It's the effect of 30 years of the type of relationship that we've been building. It's the multiplicity of agencies and actors at the national, but also subnational, the number of governors, mayors, trade associations, soccer clubs. I remember when I was ambassador and I was in Tijuana, and I suddenly see streams and streams and streams of Americans coming across Mesa de Otay, decked in the colors of the Tijuana. Because San Diego had adopted the Xolos, the Xoloscuincles, the soccer team of San Diego as their own, because San Diego at the time did not have a soccer team. So absolutely, the dynamics and the nature of the relationship have changed. And that's what, in many ways, despite 4 years of Trump, and despite some of the tensions, real tensions in play today, the wheels haven't fallen off. But a Trump 2.0 administration with the profound impact and change, and with no guardrails that I think a Trump 2.0 administration would bring along with it, could pose a serious challenge with, if it's Claudia, a president who isn't as charismatic and as popular as López Obrador, and who can't marshal opinion to say and to pretend and to spin that, oh, Trump loves Mexico and has always respected Mexico.
Yeah, no, and we'll see, but perhaps less sinuous, yes, in argument. No, but I think that the depth of that relationship, to sum up, does mean that Mexico, clearly it could get very rough and it could be very difficult in the next few years. But it does mean that Mexico has some cards, and which it can play, I think, and that's
absolutely,
and that's important. So Arturo, I really enjoyed this conversation.
Likewise, Mike.
And thank you very much indeed.